I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Martin Ciupa, a subject matter expert on artificial intelligence, recognized as being in one of the top 100 experts in this field worldwide. Martin is the CEO of Remoscope, an AI-based telehealth startup, and an advisor and consultant to Mindmaze, a Unicorn Neurotech company focused on applying advanced neuroscience to everyday life. Martin has decades of experience in computing and artificial intelligence, PhD studies in AI, and a master's degree in cybernetics. He joins us today to discuss some of today's most interesting questions on artificial intelligence. So, Martin, welcome back, sir. It's been a while. Thank you so much for joining me. I want to jump right into the headlines here. A story broke last week about an Air Force AI that, quote unquote, killed the human operator in a simulated war game to avoid being restrained from destroying targets. I have to emphasize all those words. So, quote unquote, killed and then definitely simulated in the story. And the story went that the Air Force then modified the AI to prevent it from killing the operator. So instead, it started destroying communications infrastructure to prevent the operator from controlling it so that it could complete its mission. So what are your thoughts on that story overall?
Well, the first point to make is that, yeah, it was a very interesting piece of news, but it was a little bit premature in its original casting, in as much that it was retracted just, I think, yesterday, worst case the day before, as a thought experiment, not even a simulation. So the kernel that reported it was really taking misuse of the word simulation. It was more to do, these things are the things that could go wrong in actual practice. And the background to it, so it's less of a clear evidence that a actual designed AI had made this mistake, more of AIs of this class could make that mistake. And basically how it arises is that prior to artificial general intelligence, you build artificial narrow intelligence, which are specified to particular well-described tasks. Now, all of your listeners who are software engineers or project managers of one description or another will know just how important it is to get the specification of your requirements accurate, because if you don't, you can lead yourself into situations arising which are anomalous, not expected. So this particular scenario is you have a drone and it has a degree of autonomous decision making to be able to make a signature analysis for a target. And it's programmed to look for solutions in varying, how can I say, fog of war kind of changes from expectations. So it goes into a flight path and it detects a signal, and then some things happen which prevent it from fulfilling its goal, which is to destroy that target. So autonomously, it then seeks to find out what is the reason why it can't hit that target. And if that reason is because of some issue with its command structure, if it identifies that as what is blocking it from fulfilling its mission, it might choose to, well, I'll resolve it by taking out the command structure. And so this is the background to the notion that these autonomous weapons could attack the side from which they are originating from. And this was more of a thought experiment as it is as actual simulation. In a simulation, you would expect to be using the software, but you are presenting it with a scenario, maybe in a kind of metaverse simulation, and seeing how the actual software would perform. But this was a thought experiment, so it's not as dramatic as it's being depicted. It was corrected, and the kernel who misspoke did take back his words. So it just shows you, don't read everything that you come across in newspapers,
Well,
particularly in the AI.
you're absolutely right. So the retraction to this was run in Forbes, and the Air Force did backpedal and said it was a thought experiment. I believe it was Colonel Tucker Cinco Hamilton, who was chief of the Air Force's AI test and operations, who had originally made that statement. And a lot of times when military officers are talking with the press, they try and be clear, but there are always potential communications issues. So I think it could have just been as simple as that. What
Yeah.
interested me about this, though, was the fact that this thought experiment, I guess, made it into the press and then got kind of broadcast, says a little bit more about human fear and uncertainty about AI than it does about AI itself, right?
But yeah, particularly now where there's so much hype about the advent of what we might say is the path towards artificial general intelligence. And people are talking about the risks of that. And I know that we're going to go over some of these issues, and that's fine. But yeah, it's a fever pitch kind of level that we're at the moment. And you have people who are AI experts and people who are not, making all sorts of comments, some of which are reasonable, others which are perhaps a little bit fantasy, science fiction like. And it's important to really get to grips with the issue. And there's been so much going on. I mean, I was looking at a cartoon which I posted on social media the other day, and it says, gosh, it feels like a decade since GPT-3 was launched. And the person sitting next to the party who just said that, said, well, it's only been 2 years. Well, since chatbot was ChatGPT, I should say, was launched just less than sort of 9 months ago. It feels like a decade. There's been so much going on in this field. So yeah, people are their alert levels are elevated, and you have two sides: the people who are strong proponents, who think the idea that these systems represent an existential risk is ridiculous, and you get people who say, well, not so much, it really is a potential risk. And then you have people who are the godfathers of AI, some of which are on the pro AI, no risk side of the equation, and two of the others are basically on the side that this is perhaps too risky, and some kind of timeout is needed to assess and regulate.
Well, and so you'd said fever pitch a moment ago, and I think that those are the perfect words to describe where things are at. A group of AI experts signed a joint letter just recently stating that, quote unquote, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. So prior to that, there was the letter proposing the 6-month moratorium. And, both of these were signed by numerous AI experts. But it seems like a little bit of a mixed message. So, number one, I'm wondering, should we slow down or stop entirely? And then number two, the same experts who signed the letter are the ones who are actually developing this software, which to me seems a little bit like the music industry telling parents that rock and roll is the devil's music.
Good analogy, funny analogy. Well, let's roll back some of those issues. And it's a complicated and political situation, I think. Yes, you're right. There was this Future of Life Institute, a request for a 6-month moratorium on development of ChatGPT and other large language models generative AI. I was one of them that signed it. My rationale for signing it was, let's get regulation in place. It's not saying let's stop all research in AI. It's let's not really launch anything in the next 6 months. And subsequent to that, OpenAI, who was the leader at the time in terms of the deployment of such systems, made a announcement that they weren't going further than GPT-4 anyway. Now so yes, you're right, there was this request for a moratorium, and the idea was things like, are there emergent properties which we didn't expect from the design of these transformer-based generative AI algorithms, which are like autocomplete, where you provide a prompt and it develops a response based upon deep learning from very large data sets of pretty much the whole of the internet, or a very large portion of it. So the situation with these large language models, generative AI, is that they are statistically auto-completing from a prompt to a response. Yet there are some people claiming that there is potentially emergent properties which were not expected to develop from that design. In particular, with regards to reasoning that was not expected. People refer to it as rational or Kahneman system 2 reasoning that was not expected. And the idea was that this is a potential risk, because if there are emergent properties which were not expected, could those emergent properties also include the development of its own intents, so that it could decide that what it needed to do was not so much the keeping within the guardrails that had been specified for it, but to go beyond those. And you had all of these prompt engineering, do anything now attacks, which got pretty ridiculous. But those were really taking on personas. And the research which has been done subsequently suggests that this emergence of properties may not be the case, and that it's really just a hallucination. So, coming back to the point, the need perhaps for a moratorium is not now so pressing as it was expected about 4 or 5 months ago. Particularly, as I say, because OpenAI and other parties have decided not to build a further larger models. And this emergence that I was referring to was considered to be perhaps a function of the larger model size was producing this emergence of new properties. Now, there are other potential political motivations for this, because you have people such as the leadership of OpenAI and other parties going before Congress and requesting urgent regulation of the tools that they have introduced, even though when some of the CEO of OpenAI goes to Europe, where the regulation of AI is more advanced, and tells the EU, well, maybe he'll withdraw ChatGPT from Europe. So he's on one side saying regulation is needed, and on the other side, well, if that regulation impacts my bottom line, and if there's potential fines for misuse of these systems, then they'll take their toys away from the playpen. So that is odd. And then there was an article, it actually came out from a Google engineer, saying that, I think the expression was, they have no moat, M-O-A-T, meaning to say no protection from open source. So you have these open source models, like Meta's Llama model and others such as Bloom, and there are a bunch of open source models. It's actually a plethora of them are coming out now. And the idea is maybe some of these well-established corporate bodies are pushing the agenda of regulation so that the open source entities will have a harder time of entering the market. So
Okay.
exactly what is happening in this to and fro of the benefits and the downsides of regulation, and whether people should be stopping developments, maybe how can I say, a commercial tactic.
Yeah. Well, in terms of potential harm, I want to get into this. You actually provided me with 4 classes, and so I want to jump into those because the first one you mentioned a moment ago, today's AI are error prone and tend to confabulate or hallucinate. And I've read that word in a variety of places. I think that's kind of the best way to describe it, where sometimes it will just make stuff up. And I think one of the scary aspects to that is it's pretty convincing in conveying its hallucinations. You know, there have been several reports with ChatGPT where it would insist to users it was correct, and it was just, you know, way off base. And the user actually corrected it in some of those earlier versions. The user would correct it, and if I recall, it was chastising the user, basically. So, you know, that's I
Yeah.
guess class number one. Is that something that'll just be corrected over time as software issues?
But let's just dig into that,
Oh,
because there's some significant issues before we go on to the second class. So yes, some of those problems will be rectified by the establishment of guardrails and a technique called reinforcement learning by human feedback, so that inappropriate responses are checked before they are delivered to the end user. So things like racism, sexism, and threats and things like this should be prevented. The problem with that notion is that there's an infinite number of ways of being able to express a response or to analyze a response because of the choice of words. And so having a technique which catches 99% doesn't mean to say it's going to catch all. So there will be, with this technology, quite likely always the opportunity for some error and confabulation, hallucination. And in high stakes applications, such as in healthcare, financial advice, you don't want to have to say to your user, oh, I'm sorry that your father took the advice to take that level of insulin and has gone into a coma. The system misspoke. Or, yeah, I'm sorry, the system recommended suicide, as one, I think it was ChatGPT did with a Belgian person, and the deceased party's wife claims that the prompting to about advice over suicide was the cause of her husband's demise. So you can imagine in high stakes applications where you're asking questions where people's health or their financial assets, they're advising you to do things which are in error, and maybe they catch 99%. But if you have millions upon millions of users, you're going to have huge
yeah.
class action suits.
So a second class of concern is not AI being mistaken, but AI being actively used by bad actors for, as you've described it, highly effective scamming, personal data theft, cyber attacks, ransomware, and influencing unethical voting behavior, right? So it could be
Right.
used by bad actors to steal money, and that could be, you know, a criminal. It could also be used by a government or a political party to simply sway the vote, you know, and I think that those are all really important concerns. And again, this goes to the AI being told to lie, but doing it very persuasively in a way that a human probably wouldn't be able to. So what are your thoughts
Right.
on the second class of concerns?
Yes, well, the first class that I referred to is one that exists now. This second class exists now, but not in as, how can I say, a profound way as it could be with the use of these AI tools. Because you may well be having a conversation with a very persuasive English speaker that is speaking in a very familiar voice. If it's a scam, it may well be mimicking a family member. And this can be done with this technology to such a point where vulnerable citizens, seniors and the like, may well be persuaded to part with their money, or personalized Cambridge Analytica style voting direct messaging tailored to individuals based upon their personal social media profiles, such that it can give an extra 3, 4, 5% of votes, or influence people to vote in a particular way. And those could come from bad actors outside of the country, as was suggested happened in the US elections earlier. That is potentially imminent, because the technology has been around for maybe 6 months now, a little bit longer. APIs are being developed that allow those systems to make calls, to access WhatsApp and Messenger and use and make dial out to parties. So yeah, it's a genuine area of concern in those areas that you mentioned, that you listed.
Yeah. Well, so let me go on to number 3, which is Nick Bostrom's Paperclip Maximizer experiment. And again, this is one that you gave me, where basically this is kind of an existential risk. And if I remember this correctly, the idea was you tell the AI to make paper clips, do it as efficiently as possible. And, you know, at some point it disassembles the entire world to make paper clips.
Yeah, it sounds weird, doesn't it? But it actually is an example of that first case that we talked about an autonomous weapon. You giving a mission for it to fulfill. And when it is stymied in that mission completion, it autonomously looks for ways of completing that mission and comes up with a solution which is not in the interest of the operator.
Yeah.
So this is just the fact that the system is intelligent enough to do things which are not what the operator wanted it to do, but nevertheless fulfills the mission at the cost to the operator as much as to any other goal.
Well, and that could be a number of things. I mean, you know, in the AI's processing or calculation matrix, right? Like right now might be a really good time for a preemptive nuclear strike. So, I mean, there are a lot of different ways that could be expressed. It doesn't necessarily just need to be the paperclip maximizer. And I think, again, that's the concern, is the unpredictability of how it's solving these, and probably the need for the guardrails.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there are so many examples you can find in sci-fi where the systems fail and put people in jeopardy. And it's because they're intelligent enough to seek solutions, but not defined to seek solutions with a tight enough scope to prevent existential risk. And I think as the autonomous weapons are more and more developed with the use of AI, getting this right is becoming more important. I mean, it's almost like a Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Love the Bomb. I forget the exact title of that movie now. Where you have a doomsday weapon, whereby the system, locks out humans from stopping it from doing what it's going to do if a country is attacked. And those are weird and strange scenarios. But yeah, the thing about it is that if you do not specify completely, a system might find a way around to do something what you don't want it to do. And it's almost like a philosophical impossibility in a complex scenario to design guardrails to stop all possibilities that could be thought of. And that's where it really comes from. I mean, I in my post, I referred to it not only in terms of Bostrom's paperclip analogy, but that of the Disney movie, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where, I don't know if you remember, in Fantasia, Mickey is given a task of taking buckets of water to fill up a tub. And what happens is that he borrows the sorcerer's magic hat and commands a broom to do that job. So it goes out, it starts carrying water, but he gets struck by lightning, which was not envisaged, and multiple copies of the broom are manifested, and he ends up basically drowning the castle until the sorcerer wakes up and stops it all. Because Mickey, in that, as a protagonist there, couldn't think of the possibilities of where it could go wrong.
Yeah. Well, so class number 4 here is basically, I interpreted this as the singularity, where it's not necessarily a mistake, it's not necessarily an error, but as AI becomes more intelligent, I guess, more aware, potentially self-aware. I think one of the tenets of the singularity was continuously self-improving, right? At some point, I mean, it could look at humanity and say, these folks need to be managed. I'm going to clamp down and control them, right? It could also be that it just feels threatened by humanity and decides to wipe us all out. And, and it could do that in a very well-reasoned manner, which is still really against our interests, right? So that seems like that was how you were expressing class number 4.
Yeah, and it comes also invokes this idea that we very briefly touched on about emergence and whether the system could have intents of its own as emergent properties, such that it made decisions and plans to do things that weren't in the original guardrails, and so it went beyond its position. And there are parties that say, no, that couldn't happen, but there are other parties that say, well, emergence is a potential modality that could occur. And I think that's partly the fears that was in the moratorium letter, that we should stop making larger and larger models because we may have this emergence and get into a very difficult situation. The thing about superintelligence, if it is truly superintelligent, we don't know what kind of solutions. We can't figure out what a superintelligence would make of the scenario. And it, again, it's a little bit like class 3. You could, design the system to look after the ecosystem, so to sort of protect the ecosystem. And the superintelligence looks at it and says, well, the only way to protect the ecosystem is to remove the party that's causing the problems,
Yeah.
which is, say, us. So that's, I think, quite a long way off, because I don't think the emergence of intent development and self-awareness is on the cards. Because if you remember back just a little over a year ago, we had the Google Lambda debacle about its large language model being sentient. And it was hallucinating and responding in ways to satisfy the prompts by the engineer that eventually got terminated. So it mimicked that it had sentience, but none of the experts considered that it did have such. But you don't have to have sentience to be dangerous. In point of fact, sentience can be sometimes prevent you from being dangerous because you may have empathy. If you don't have any empathy because you have no self-awareness and no capability of thinking like the ethic of reciprocity, whereby I wouldn't want this to be done to me, because it would just be a violation of my rights. So I shouldn't violate the rights of others as a reciprocal ethic. So sentience is a double-edged sword. It can actually help you develop your own intents, but it might also give you the ability to say that intent is an unethical one. And so you could apply it into a general AGI scenario where you never encountered a set of rules for a particular scenario. So it would think, well, this is a novel scenario, and however, my moral compass says that I shouldn't do this. Well, if it's difficult to know, because all of these things that we're talking about are not understood how they will play out in practice. So we're a little bit obscured in terms of, is this a real problem or is this just a fantasy? We don't know. And we need to do a lot more work to find out.
On that note, let me thank you so much for your time today, Martin. And I want to close actually with this question, because this time last year, as you alluded to earlier, Google Lambda convinced one researcher that it was sentient. 6 months ago, ChatGPT started making headlines for, human level writing capabilities and gaslighting users. So where do you think that will be 6 months to a year from now?
Yeah, so I think that's a short enough time frame for things not to move that much, despite the fact that the last year has felt like a decade, as I was saying earlier. But I don't think things are going to change that much. I think there's going to be a rush to regulation over the next 6 months, and that's necessary. So there's going to be a lot of compliance development, and that's a good thing. Safety first principles should have been the first principles that were developed, but competitive Silicon Valley ethics sort of put that to the side. It's interesting, will open source come into the picture? It's an interesting question. Will additional capabilities to reach out across the internet really bring about these bad actors and influence elections coming up in the next election cycle? This needs to be monitored. So those are the short-term risks. In 4 to 5 years, we should be looking towards that class 3 and class 4. Are we developing autonomous weapons in ways that could do things that they were never designed to do, dangerous things? Or the worst case, class 4, where there's an emergent property that we didn't expect, and that property is really putting humanity in existential risk. So there's just a tremendous amount of work to be done. And there's people who think it's impossible and people who think it's possible. There's a statistic called probability of doom, P open brackets doom close brackets. The point about that probability is it's not non-zero. There is a risk. And the issue is, how big is that risk? I think we're going to find those class 1, class 2 occurring within the next 18 months. So there's going to be a reaction in the next 18 months. I can almost feel that is a definite scenario. Now, is that reaction going to be big enough to cause an AI winter? I don't think so. But it's going to be interesting next 2 or 3 years in AI. That's a fact.
Martin, let me thank you again so much for your time today.
You're welcome, Ed.